Hello and welcome to the StartupBREW Fargo podcast. StartupBREW is a weekly event hosted by Emerging Prairie in downtown Fargo, where we believe that entrepreneurship is energized over brews. Each week, we bring entrepreneurs, founders, and innovators together because we believe they succeed when they have access to each other and the community that supports them. This week, we heard from Benya Kraus, co-founder of Lead for America. Benya returned to rural Minnesota after graduating from Tufts University with a mission to help other hometown fellows return to their communities while working to inspire individuals to engage in their counties, towns, and districts. Not only is she a co-founder, but also the director of Lead for America's newest track, the American Connection Corps, designed to accelerate broadband access and digital inclusion across rural America. Let's listen in as Benya shares her story.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so cool. I'm with my colleague, Molly Byron today, and she is getting all my whispers of, did you take a photo of that? That looks so cool. Look how happy they are. So thank you for being so happy and here. I guess before I begin, would love to just hear how many of you are born and raised from Fargo and chose to stay? Woo, awesome. How many of you born, raised in Fargo, left, and now came back? Okay, cool. And then how many of you are not from Fargo at all but chose to make this place your home? Oh, wow. Amazing. Well, so I first wanted to begin with that and kind of speak. I'm going to throw in some Sarah Smarshin here. I don't know if any of you read her, but she has a podcast called The Homecomers, which when I first moved back to Minnesota to start the state affiliate of our national organization, Lead for America, I went a 30-day listening tour across the entire state, visited 30 small towns, spoke to over 100 distinctive conversations with people, and just lived really in my car, which also meant that I was also living on people's couches. But what got me through the very long drives was this podcast called Homecomers. And she gave this definition of what a homecomer is, which I'll just read out loud here. She says, homecomers are residents and advocates who remain committed to places where society and the economy would have them get out. They are preserving and strengthening the vibrancy and inclusiveness of small towns, rural lands, and misunderstood communities that headlines claim are dying. And what I loved about that definition is how expansive it was. It wasn't, this is a place where you were born and raised and are coming back to. It wasn't about necessarily, being attached to a physical space, but thinking expansively of what does it mean to be a homecomer. And the words of that definition that really stuck out to me was A, being committed to place, to be preserving and strengthening the vibrancy and inclusiveness of that place. And that really resonated with me because when I think of my own homecoming story, right, and what Lead for America does, I like to say we are in the process of cultivating homecomers. So we are in the business of homecoming. And what that looks like for me, so a little bit of my personal story on this first date here. I say home is a split between Waseca, Minnesota, and Bangkok, Thailand. So Waseca is a rural community, about 10,000 people in southern Minnesota, about an hour and 15 south from the Twin Cities. And Thailand is where my mom's hometown is. So my dad grew up as one of 9 on our family farm. It's now in its 6th generation of farming. My mom also grew up in agriculture. Her dad was the dean of agriculture at the agricultural school at Chiang Mai University. And so he grew corn, soy, and hogs, and she grew mangoes. And her dad actually studied abroad at Oklahoma University and then learned about FFA, was so inspired, took FFA and brought it back to Thailand. So FFT, it's not quite as large, but FFT is actually my grandfather. And I begin with their stories because I was born in Thailand and grew up on the East Coast, back to Bangkok for high school, but every summer and every Christmas was spent on our family's farm in Waseca. And now the narrative that I had of Waseca growing up was that, at one time we were the hub for fun fact, we had the highest number of engineers per capita in the entire country. And that is because we were home to E.F. Johnson, which was a radio manufacturing company. So we had a lot of audio engineers. We also were home to Brown Printing, which was a big printing factory as well. And we also had a U of M campus. The narrative that I got, though, so I was born in 95. In 1990, our U of M campus actually closed and turned into a federal penitentiary. That also same kind of decade, Brown Printing and E.F. Johnson, as those industries changed, weren't able to also compete with that. So ended up actually closing and taking several hundred jobs with it. Now, I was born in the 90s, right, and grew up and spent a lot of time in Waseca in the 2010s. And so by the time that I was growing up and experiencing Waseca, the narrative that I got was that this place was dying. I had my cousins say, wow, you live in Bangkok, the East Coast, we can't wait to get out of here. And I loved Waseca for all sort of nostalgic reasons, but I definitely, when I went to college to study international relations out in Boston, never thought I would ever return back to Waseca. I studied IR because I felt that cities were where magic was happening, and when I thought about what I wanted to do, I thought I was going to be moving every 2 to 3 years from one city to the next. And I kind of carried that with me really until my junior year of college. A family situation brought me back, and I, at this point, had been studying community development from a very theoretical standpoint. I was looking at case studies, was trying to figure out what made some communities thrive and others collapsed. And that summer when I returned back, I diverted this DC internship, was kind of bummed that, this family situation was bringing me back. But when my family was struggling that summer, people who I couldn't even remember but knew my grandpa, knew my aunts and uncles, knew my dad when he was an FFA student, had no reason to really care about me, but came out of the woodwork to support our family. And a story that really just carries with me, Julie Spees, who I love talking about. She's our mail lady. And when I was a kid, I would collect stamps. And so me and my cousin Allison would wait at the mailbox every single day at 3 p.m., except for Sundays, waiting for the mail to come. And we would get it, cut out the stamps, put it and soak it in water, and then have it dry. And Julie, after I had gone to high school and college, it had been a few summers since I had been back. But when she heard I was in town, she came with a packet of letters with all the mail that she couldn't deliver over several years, kind of, I guess, knowing that maybe one day I would come back and be ready to collect my stamps. And that summer was a series of moments where people who had no reason to love me just did. And that opened me up to going off of our farm and more into our main street. And I started realizing that we had this Vision 2030 process where the community was declaring what is the destiny that we want to take control of. And it hit, 4 key kind of pillars of rural development, but at the heart of it was saying, we can't do any of this if we don't find a way to attract and retain our young people. Because all the people that are going to be needed to serve on the committees to get shit done, all the people that are going to be part of Rotary clubs, civic associations, are ultimately, it's our human talent. And if we are exporting our most valuable resource, what is the future of our community? And so that really just sparked a whole new understanding about my community. It was the first time I learned about the history of my family and all the generations of people for the past 6 that did not know who Benya Kraus was, but every action that they were taking in each moment, every commitment they were making to attend a Rotary meeting, to fight for watershed protection, to think about conservation on our family farm, all of those string of mini moments ended up leading to me and my existence. And so what did I owe all those mini moments and the people who made those mini commitments over and over and over, and how might my life have purpose because of the commitments I was making? So long story short, I ended up coming back my senior year of college, determined on trying to get myself back to Minnesota and ideally even back to Waseca. Then my, idealistic bubble kind of popped when I realized that when you go to a career fair your senior year, no one in public service is coming to you. No one from Waseca is coming to you. No one even from Minnesota is coming to you. Instead, you have a handful of firms and a handful of cities and all of your peers who you had done student council with, debate, all these clubs you were, doing this work together. Many of them might have written personal statement essays about how they were using this college degree to be able to improve and bring it back to their communities. But when senior year, fall semester comes, you feel like a dud if you have not signed on the dotted line with many of the law firms, finance companies, software tech programs that are offering you these pathway programs to get to be introduced to their companies and end up being, I realized, on this pathway to say, okay, you might be signing up for a 2-year program, but now you're brought into law school, you've got debt, and now, 6, 7, 8, 10 years down the line, you're actually in the same place that maybe you didn't necessarily want to be, but it felt like it was the right thing to do. And so this was my personal experience. I luckily ended up finding 3 other co-founders of Lead for America, all of us from quote-unquote flyover states, Kansas, Boone County, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Minnesota, myself. And we were all seeing the same crisis that our top talent from college were going into a handful of cities and a handful of firms and leaving many of the communities that they were rooted in, not necessarily because they wanted to, but because it felt like the only successful path for them. Fast forward today, I'm now back in my hometown, but our pathway to getting there is the creation of Lead for America. So we are a national organization that recruits, trains, and places young leaders into 2-year paid fellowships back in their hometown communities to be working on their community's toughest challenges. We are pretty new. We were co-founded in 2018. We were living off of ramen and eggs that entire year, had an idea and a program that didn't quite exist yet, but put an open call out for homecomers all across the country. We thought we'd pilot it with 10 fellows our first year and ended up getting 1,800 registered applicants with a very small recruitment budget, and ended up in our first year placing 54 fellows across 18 states. The following year, we ended up having 106 fellows altogether across 28 states. And now this year, we'll be launching our largest ever cohort at once of 100 fellows serving over 30 states. Part of that is we have launched several state affiliates, so that allows us to get closer to rural communities and places that these national service programs don't often reach. So here in Minnesota, I came back and started our state affiliate, Lead for Minnesota. We now have this fall of 40 fellows serving small towns all across the state, as well as 5 tribal nations. And we also brought on Nebraska, Hawaii, Kansas, and the city of Poughkeepsie, New York as part of that. And we're kind of, as we look to expand, North Dakota would be an awesome next state. And lastly, I'll say too, we also just partnered with Land O'Lakes and the American Connection Project. So if you've heard of the American Connection Project, it's a coalition of 150 companies that are advocating for the largest federal investment, $80 billion over the next 5 years into broadband infrastructure. And while all of that work is happening and coordinated federally, we also wanted to make sure that those resources were being coordinated locally. So we're also going to be supporting 50 fellows across 12 states as part of the inaugural American Connection Corps. So fellows working on digital inclusion as well as broadband infrastructure. So that's a little bit about the work that we do. And I'm going to sit because I can see Emma lurking. But I just wanted to kind of, end with saying we're in the business and the process and movement of building homecomers. I can see already here the energy of what happens when you have people who come home, not just to a physical place, but I think also coming home within themselves and to what their authentic and true purpose. And I think we find that true purpose when we make commitments to place that are larger than just ourselves. So I will pause now, but thank you so much for having me.
After the presentations, we opened up our conversation to a live Q&A session with the audience, joined by our host, Emma McIntyre, who is also the lead coordinator of StartupBREW Fargo. Let's listen in.
Well, we are going to jump into our audience Q&A. So if while she was speaking, you were like, this would be a great question, raise your hand. I will repeat it for our digital audience, or if you're not privy to raising your hand in front of other people, understandable. You can tweet your questions into @StartupBrewFargo, and they'll pop up here on my handy-dandy technology, and we shall ask. So first question to kick us off. You wrapped up with some really awesome statistics of your recruitment for the last year. Can you share what you are most proud of in 2020?
It always is our fellows. It was so challenging, everyone, to launch Fellows, a cohort program that is all about community revitalization and connecting one-on-one with people and doing that in a global pandemic. But honestly, our fellows have done such a tremendous job. They begin their fellowships by doing listening tours of their entire community. So it's literally just we have one fellow in Fairmont, Minnesota, who just went down Main Street business to Main Street business to Main Street business. And he hangs out with a group of like old ladies every Saturday because he realized that all the gossip in town happened on that Saturday morning at this one coffee shop. So, it's just examples of that I think our fellows have really understand viscerally, and the impact of that over time, right? We had also this past year, one of our fellows who went back to Monument Valley, Utah as part of the Navajo Nation, through her listening tour, got connected to a woman who became her mentor, and together they formed this just like grassroots collaborative to raise over $10 million and distribute food and medical supplies when COVID hit to the entire Navajo Nation. So she actually was just featured in an Oscars advertisement. Verizon asked if she would want to talk about her community and her experience. So if you've seen the Oscars, you might know Shandine Herrera. But that's always, it's the success of our fellows that I think are like the cornerstone of the work that we do.
That is wild. Wow. Congratulations. That's fantastic. On that high note, do we have any questions from our audience? Yes, Jordan.
First of all, the homecoming story and the community support, that's just an awesome story, and I would love to see that movie, so if you want to. I just wanted to ask if you wanted to share maybe another story of one of your fellows and one of the projects they did or the impact they made on their community.
Yeah, he asked for our digital audience to expand into one of your favorite fellow stories.
Yeah. It's always so hard to choose because they're doing such everywhere. We have such a diversity of places. I talk about rural communities, but we also have fellows that have moved back to, economically distressed urban communities too. I guess, Evan Bonsall, if we're going to keep it up at the upper Midwest here, he's from Marquette, Michigan. I love his story because it's also so tied into the personal conviction to place. He got a scholarship to go to Harvard and was somebody who wrote his personal statement on, I want this degree so I could bring it back to my hometown, and then actually did through the course of the fellowship. So he was working in the county's economic development office and was one of the kind of principal people that was advocating for this massive grant with NASA to bring a space station to Marquette. And it happened. And he also ran and got elected as the youngest ever Marquette City Commissioner. So he then brought after every city commission meeting, he does this Facebook live stream where he debriefs and tells people in a very digestible way about what the city is doing. And I am not from Marquette, but I, just for entertainment purposes, because he's so engaging, will just listen in on what is going on in Marquette, Michigan. And he's just got all these different projects, but he's wrapping up his fellowship now. He is now engaged to his middle school sweetheart and just bought a house and is gonna continue on staying in Marquette as a social studies teacher, in addition to all the other hats he wears. But I love Evan's story, so thanks for letting me brag about him.
Yes, Greg.
Can you share about what the 1,800 applicants were looking for? What is a Gen Z person that's graduating? What do they want in community? What are they looking for?
Yeah. So, when we got those 1,800 registered applicants, we honestly needed to Google map where people wanted to go. And during the interview process, we would ask point blank, hey, Shandine, you are miles away from the closest grocery store where actually you all have to pre-order and ship food in. There's very little broadband infrastructure. For many of them, it's like you might be one of very few young people, so your dating prospects are gonna look pretty tough, right? And so I think, with people who apply for our fellowship, I think there's multiple tiers, right, of the general Gen Z, and then I think also the people that are attracted to this program. We ask that question of why would you want to return when all these things are missing that most, standard economic developers would say this community is going to fail because it doesn't have X, Y, and Z. And then the look that we get back from them is saying, well, if I don't do it, who will? And so that is, I will say, the people who apply for our fellowship are those who, I like to use the term entrepreneur. They might not be starting businesses, but when you think about what does it look like to see where there is need and then figure out what is the gift that I can bring to fill that need, that's who we bring on as fellows. Now, larger than that, because we have part of the fellowship is that you are also a multiplier effect. So how are you recruiting additional young people to your community? And so I think there's a second layer there of like just generally Gen Zers, what are they looking for? And in Minnesota, we kind of define homecomer more broadly. So we, look, okay, maybe you have a specific connection to this placement community, but also it could be broadly your home state or where you went to college. And so we first lead with like, what is the need? What is the impact that you can make? And I do think that is, especially with this new generation, like wanting to feel useful and that you can see immediate impact in the work that you do. But then it goes also into, okay, well, what is a day in the life in this community like? So when I'm selling a community placement to a fellow in Minnesota, I begin with the need that you can address and tailor it really to, I saw that you participated in this club and were part of this organization, studied this thing, this is what your senior thesis was on. This is an opportunity to not just think theoretically about it, but actually do something. And here's what will happen to the community if you don't bring your gift to it. We get that, injection there. Then it's about, okay, quality of life. So in Hibbing, Minnesota, what is like Boomtown Pub looking like on a Friday night, right? Who are the people in the community that would be your friend and actually painting that picture for them? I then also think it's so important for rural communities, particularly, to also say that this is an inclusive, welcoming place. Because even if you are not from like necessarily like a racial minority, right? You still, I think all of us like want to be able to enjoy other cultures and things that people have to offer that are different from our own. So it benefits everybody when we can say there are cultures here and microcultures, and you get to still experience that. And so let's celebrate that. And even if, you're still a pretty homogenous community, there are people or leaders that are trying to change that culture, and we'll connect you to those people. So I think ultimately it's like a train of pieces here, right? Of like, what is the opportunity and need, but then also what is the vibe and the place and like who are the people and friends you will make? And the more we can get that recruitment message across, I think people actually are really willing and excited to move rural.
I know I did see another question over here. Yes.
I had a question on the funding of the program.
Yeah.
How's that been working?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he asked her to expand on funding for the program.
Yeah. So our first year, we wanted to show that all of our money can be raised locally. And so we ended up having an operating budget our first year from, I mentioned going from like eating eggs for every meal to having a $2.5 million operating budget. And we did that through, we provide a service to host communities, right? So in many places, fellows are serving as, you get full-time, incredible talent to be working on initiatives that you've always had to keep on the back burner for a while, right? But we can offer you that for a fraction of the cost of what it would take to be bringing on a full-time person, putting them on your payroll, benefits, and all of that. So it's actually a very attractive thing to a lot of resource-strapped, especially, local governments was a huge, component of our host sites that we're bringing on fellows. So I saw somebody from the EDA here. I talked to a lot of EDA meetings, and I think, EDA boards have seen the impact economically that a fellow can bring to their community. So there's that piece. But to make sure that we can be reaching places that are hardest to reach, we also then look at local and regional foundations and community philanthropy to offset whatever that cost would be. We raised all of that money our first year, $2.5 million, all in state and like local dollars. As we've grown, we've also now become a federal AmeriCorps program, which has meant that we're able to tap into national service, which has been around for decades now, since the 90s, to be able to make sure we can actually be reaching places that often don't get that national service. That means that fellows don't have to pay their federal student loans while they serve, and they get an education award at the end of each year of service as well.
Ooh. That's nice. Heck yes. I know I saw Glenn.
Thanks for what you're doing first.
Thanks.
What I wanted to know, you talked a little bit about the selection of your fellows.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do to train, develop, and support them?
Yeah. There's a lot of that. So Our fellows, before they begin their service, actually go through a training institute with us. So our first year was actually a whole month-long training institute where they lived and studied and learned together. And we were in both DC and Boston. This year, we're actually going to be bringing them to Shreveport, Louisiana. And the training is both a combination of like personal and professional leadership development, understanding macro level challenges around, our economy, our like food systems, all of that at a macro level, to give them a lens to say, okay, when I go back home and I'm seeing these dynamics play out locally, what are some of the underlying causes for why I see what I do? But then also ultimately it's a lot of experiential learning. So over the course also of the fellowship, we bring them to different places, both rural, tribal, urban settings, to understand what are the best practices and things that we can learn from these places and seed back into our hometowns. And then ultimately, I'll also say, we developed, or I'd say curated, a leadership model that I won't go into depth because I'll get really nerdy about it, but it's called convergent leadership. And it talks about how do we hold at the convergence this balance between justice, foresight, service, and innovation. So it's actually like on a praxis like this. And right, so the crux of it is saying innovation and service are tied together. So you can be incredibly curious, like evidence-based, generative with your innovation, but if it is also not tied to service of being proximate, culturally humbled, and empowering, you might just be innovating for the sake of innovating and not actually bringing your innovation to where it's needed most. And similarly, right, if we are so embedded in community, really proximate, but we're also not challenging ourselves to think differently, then we're also out of convergence. So that's a little bit of a snippet of some of the leadership development and I think some of the values that we also try to instill in our cohort.
I did see. We'll take one last. Scott. Heck yes. You.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about the tension between like local flexibility and programmatic measurements and standardization. So I'm curious what you measure and like what your donors are asking for, and then how you allow your local fellows to kind of do what they think they need to do.
Yeah. So we have every quarter these convergent deliverables that are things that we set as kind of structure of, as part of the program, every fellow goes through a listening tour. Then, the next quarter, you take what you've seen and like heard as need, and then start developing this kind of, community portfolio of documenting what those challenges and those assets are. And then by your second year is all about you launching, a community venture that you think best responds to tackling that challenge. And for some, they are embedded in an institution that actually empowers them to be able to, tackle affordable housing challenges or tackle childcare challenges or focus on entrepreneurship, like ecosystem development. And so it's a very, it works exactly, they are in an organization that allows them to do that. In other cases, it might be adjacent. And so we actually work with our host partner to be able to say, part of this is bringing young people back and allowing their creativity to take hold. And by getting proximate to the challenges that your community is facing, they're both bringing additional immediate capacity, but over the long term, if we want to retain them, we have to figure out what is their unique gifts and what sparks their passion, right? And so we actually then are able to every quarter reassess whatever project scope we had the fellow come in to do and make sure that it's still in alignment in some way with also the host partner ultimately, but also that this sense of creativity can kind of blossom. So because of that, and we get federal funding, so it's like a lot of reporting that we do, right? And I think actually has allowed us to reach rural communities that wouldn't otherwise be able to handle all that federal reporting because we're doing it. But we do a lot of metrics around broadly community engagement and who are the new communities you are reaching as a result of having a fellow? How is the host organization service reaching more people more effectively? How is capacity being built that way? But it's flexible enough that we can kind of, make sure that it's being tailored to what the local community needs.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. I do want to leave on one final question, which is, what is one thing that each of us can do to help energize the work that you're doing at Lead for America?
Bring us to North Dakota. But I do mean that seriously. Our mode of expansion, and I'm definitely biased because I also, lead a state affiliate now. But the only way this work can expand is if there is local ownership over it. Our ability to reach places that society would have us get out depends on local entrepreneurs in their states stepping up and doing their own sort of listening tour across the state. So in every state that we expand into, we look for an institutional home. It can be a solo entrepreneur that is like, yes, I want to take this and fly. I want to get into my car and visit communities all across the state. Or it can be an organization that is already in this space doing it and could also, benefit from, the model. So if you have any ideas on who might either be that partner or that solo entrepreneur here in North Dakota, I would be glad and happy to talk with you.
Can you go one level deeper? What are you looking for? How much capital? How much time?
Oh, yeah. Okay, all right. So we actually provide a matching grant for whatever that organization or that solo entrepreneur is. So we bring some startup capital to that as well. To give an example, in Minnesota, I came back home with a seed grant of $100,000 from the Bush Foundation. Shout out to Bush. And by the end of that year, multiplied that seed grant into a little under a $1 million operating budget. And that is because the model itself works in a way in which the more fellows you support, so we had 20 fellows at the end of our first year, and that means we have 20 host contracts. We also have 20, communities and regions that we can also develop this kind of philanthropic landscape. And then now, as we are now in our second year, other state foundations have also stepped up. And I do, to your point earlier on, what is the funding mechanism? I also do want to give a shout out to, I mentioned the American Connection Corps. That is 50 fellows across 12 states, and it was funded essentially by 19 corporate partners, as well as some university partners in there as well. But rather than wait kind of for public dollars to come to solve this broadband development crisis, they're like, we're just going to kickstart this of having this nonprofit partnership with private capital to be able to send fellows, prove that it works, and then when you get those metrics, are able to then make the case in each of the states that we're in that this is something that has legs and is a model that can be injected with that further capital. So I hope that gets more specific.
What's the minimum to get started? If someone's going to write you a check in North Dakota, they need X amount, and how many people to get started?
Yeah.
100,000, more or less?
Yeah, I would say to run, it's how many fellows you want to have, right? I'd say in Minnesota it was 20 fellows, and that was a little under $1 million to do an operating budget. But again, that comes a lot from host contributions. I think if, we provide a matching grant, and then I think if it's 100,000 that we provide, and then 100,000 from a state funder, that gives a really good starting point for then somebody to have that capacity as an organization or a solo entrepreneur to then go and make the connections and make sure the funding can be sustained locally.
So Benya would like a check for $100,000. If anybody's willing to give it to her, let us know. You'll find her here. She'll be here after the duration of the event. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Very grateful for you and the work you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's all we have for this week's StartupBREW Fargo. Thanks for listening in. StartupBREW Fargo is energized by Emerging Prairie, an organization dedicated to connecting and celebrating the entrepreneurial ecosystem. We'd also like to thank the following sponsors for their support: Pro Resources, Brady Mertz, the FMCVB, Office Sign Company, Fargo Parks, and MIGCO. See you next time.